Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name's Beth Cohen and today we'll be talking about Enric Marco. Barcelona-born Enric Marco was celebrated as a survivor of a Nazi concentration camp, being awarded Catalonia's highest civil distinction, the Creu de Sant Jordi, publicly sharing his experiences and even representing a survivors' association. However, in 2005, the historian Benito Bermejo discovered that Marco's life story was a monumental lie. Although he did spend time in Germany during the war, Marco was never held prisoner in a concentration camp, and in reality, he voluntarily worked for the German war machine. Since then, a lot has been published on the subject. There's a book by Javier Cercas, 2 films, and endless media reports. But the question still remains, what led Marco to weave such a complicated web of lies? Joining me in the studio to talk about this fascinating topic is Cillian Shields. Hello, Cillian.
Hey, Beth, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Excited to be doing this podcast.
Yeah, me too. This is one that I've become kind of obsessed with over the past couple of weeks, researching it, and just an absolutely fascinating story.
Yeah, I mean, that makes both of us. We've watched the films, we've read the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, it's kind of all-consuming.
Okay, Cillian. So Enric Marco made the headlines in 2005 after he was publicly revealed as an imposter. And the case also brought to light the fact that, although Marco wasn't one of them, many Catalan citizens did indeed perish in the Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's something that has not always been known in Spain or in Catalonia, but it's something that around the turn of the millennium started to be really a thing that people were starting to reckon with a lot more. So during the Second World War, there were around 9,000 Spanish people, most of whom were old Republicans from the Civil War, who were obviously against Franco and therefore obviously against Hitler. They were held prisoner in various different concentration camps across the continent, of which only around 2,000 survived. Now, this was completely played down during Franco's dictatorship, and most of the survivors also never returned to Spain. So it kind of all came to a head at a very kind of fragile moment, shall we say, in the country's history.
And Enric Marco claimed to be one of these survivors.
Yeah, that's right. His big story was that he was deported from Catalonia and held prisoner in the concentration camp in Flossenbürg in Bavaria. He first started telling this fabricated story in the 1970s, and even back then there were some biographies written about his life in books about Spanish victims of the Nazi regime before he was ultimately exposed.
But being in a concentration camp wasn't the first thing that Marco had lied about.
No, exactly not. He's kind of lived a full life of lies, basically. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the writer Javier Cercas, who spent hours and hours and hours with Enric Marco, and whose book, El Impostor, The Imposter, has been a phenomenal resource for this podcast. In that, he painstakingly goes through so many details of Enric Marco's life. He exaggerated his accomplishments in the Civil War, which after the fall of the Franco dictatorship really gave him so much credit as this brave anarchist fighter. He said things like he took part in the Battle of Mallorca, he fought on the Segre front, where he says that he got really badly injured from shelling, which, despite leaving him hospitalised, he for some reason didn't need surgery or he didn't die from it, something that many doctors find very improbable. He also claimed to be fighting in the Sant Andreu barracks on July 19th. He said that he was part of the columna of the very famous anarchist leader Buenaventura Durruti. He claimed to be part of Kiko Sabaté's famous guerrilla fighters killing nationalists behind enemy lines. All of these stories served to give him this air of this amazing anarchist fighter who had such a leading part in this clandestine struggle during the dictatorship, all happening after the dictatorship was finished, all happening in the transition to democracy when there was very little chance of reprisals from the Franco forces at that period. This is a fascinating period of history because he used all of these lies in the 1970s to become the General Secretary of the CNT, which was the anarchist trade union at the time, and which had just been legalised after it played a huge role in Catalan civil life before the dictatorship. This is an extraordinary set of lies that this man has used to pave over what was ultimately a very ordinary life, kind of lacking this kind of excitement that he wanted to embellish himself with.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds very dramatic, which I suppose was the point. And Marco was a very accomplished public speaker, so he created these really compelling stories which fascinated his audiences.
Yes, exactly. For example, there's one very famous anecdote which he kind of always repeated in stories and which was even dramatized in a documentary on Catalan public television. He says this story that he was playing chess with another concentration camp inmate, in which an SS officer comes over and wants to prove his dominance against this kind of lower race. So he challenges Enric Marco to a game, and after a few moves, Enric Marco tells this very touching story that he found a way to checkmate the SS officer, and he does so despite knowing that it could supposedly cost him his life. But he does so because on that moment, he won back his dignity. He won back his freedom. He had won the Battle of Stalingrad for himself. This is always the way that he told the story. Absolute nonsense. None of this happened.
But of course, for historians, finding someone who's actually prepared to talk about their experiences must have seemed like an invaluable resource.
Oh, people lapped it up. Absolutely. But predominantly the people who didn't really have much of a knowledge about this subject are the ones who lapped it up. There were a handful, very small handful of journalists, of historians, who Marco's story rang alarm bells for. Enric Marco told stories of being in the concentration camp in such a dramatic way that it made him completely stand out among anybody who purported to be in concentration camps. Nobody spoke about it with the vivacity that Enric Marco did, because of course he completely embellished this story in order to try and convince people, but he was alone in speaking this way about the concentration camp experiences.
Yeah, of course, many genuine victims find it really difficult to talk about their experiences. And then from the year 2000 onwards, Marco was increasingly involved in public activity, and he became this sort of celebrated public figure.
Precisely. He began giving lots of talks about his experiences, appearing on television programs, like I mentioned, attending memorial services, public events, all as part of his role as president of the Amical de Mauthausen, a survivors' association set up to defend the moral and material rights of the roughly 9,000 Spanish people who were sent to Nazi concentration camps.
Yeah, in fact, he did a lot of positive work for the organisation, despite the lie.
Despite the lie, exactly. This is one of the stickiest kind of points about his story, maybe, and it's always the thing that he used to justify his lies. The fact that he always said he genuinely did do a lot of positive work for the association. He genuinely did secure grants for them, elevated the profile of the history of genuine victims of the Nazi regime. There are a lot of shades of grey areas to this. Like, it's not exactly just black and white. He did do a lot of good work, but it was ultimately based on a lie.
And of course, he could have done the same good work from an honest position.
Yes, exactly. Many historians have commented that as well, that he has a very interesting life story with the time that he genuinely did spend in Germany, and that could have been a valuable resource for historians if he gave his earnest, honest account of what happened then.
So going back to his public appearances, I think maybe the pinnacle, and it was a high point just before he was exposed, would be when he spoke in Spanish Congress during a ceremony to commemorate the victims of the Nazi regime.
That's exactly right. Yes, this happened on January 27th, 2005. This is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. He was invited to speak in the Spanish Congress, and he gave his fake, dramatic accounts of the horrors of the concentration camps, telling very chilling stories, all completely fabricated. And he reduced many MPs to tears there in the chamber.
And by this time, actually, many of the survivors who'd been in Flossenbürg had died. So that was obviously reducing the possibility of his fraud being discovered.
Yeah, this is a good point, in fact. He was very clever in his whole life. He chose Flossenbürg specifically, a very obscure concentration camp that at the time it was thought that only 14 Spanish people were held there. Nowadays we know that the number was over 140. But he chose well, he chose wisely to, like you say, reduce the possibility of being found out.
And yet he was found out quite spectacularly by Benito Bermejo in 2005. Bermejo was able to prove that he wasn't deported, but that he left Catalonia voluntarily to work for the Nazi regime. Following the discovery, he sent a report to the government and to the Amical Mauthausen Survivors Association to share his discoveries, which led to a huge media scandal.
Exactly, yeah. This was very shortly, like days before Marco was due to attend the commemoration event of the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the Mauthausen concentration camp. The Mauthausen was where most of the Spanish concentration camp victims were held, and he was due to appear alongside the then Spanish Prime Minister, José Luis Zapatero. This was in May 2005. For the Amical Mauthausen Association, the timing could not have been worse, really. Marco had lobbied very hard to bring members of the Spanish government, the Prime Minister, in fact, to attend this ceremony. And there was going to be so much public attention on this. And the historian Benito Bermejo was kind of looking at this situation, seeing Enric Marco grow and grow in stature in the media, his presence. And he could see that this could be an absolute humiliation for the victims, the genuine victims of Nazism, if this fraud were to be given such a platform alongside the Prime Minister. And Benito Bermejo did amazing work to uncover the truth right in the nick of time, really.
To find out more, we spoke to Benito Bermejo about the investigation leading up to the revelation of Enric Marco's real-life story.
Benito Bermejo first met Enric Marco at an event in memory of deceased writer Montserrat Roig at the Palau de la Música in Barcelona.
Mira, pues la primera vez ocurre con ocasión de un evento que hubo en Barcelona.
Initially, he thought Marco may have been a family member of a deported concentration camp victim, but instead, Marco told him that he himself was a victim in the Flossenbürg concentration camp.
Digo, ay, ¿en qué campo estuviste? Me dice que estuvo en el campo de Flossenbürg. Bueno.
At that time, I didn't get much of a chance to speak with him, but I don't think he was very interested in talking either.
From then, Marco started popping up on Bermejo's radar more and more, having gained some prominence with the Association for Victims of Nazism, and Bermejo had heard that Marco was getting more and more involved in education, giving talks in schools and universities. Soon, however, things started to not add up in Marco's story.
Me siguen llegando más noticias sobre él.
Details of Enric Marco's history would change every time he told it.
Veo, en fin, va cambiando un poco los detalles que cuentan sobre ese señor según la ocasión.
The next important meeting came some years later at a commemoration event in Mauthausen itself. There, Bermejo approached Marco and explained he was very interested in his story and he hoped to organise an interview, to which Marco responded very negatively.
Me dice que no. Que no voy a poder entrevistarle.
He told me no, I couldn't interview him, and the way he said this was almost violent.
Bermejo recounts that Marco said he had spoken about his history in the concentration camp plenty of times and wouldn't speak about it with Bermejo. Marco then produced a photograph of a man with his back to the camera covered in bruises and said that it was of him from shortly after the death of Franco.
Dice, aquí tienes un tema de investigación.
He told me, here's something for you to investigate, and I'm not going to speak to you about the other thing. It was obvious from how violently he said this to me that I wasn't going to get anywhere with this idea.
The photograph was the one that Javier Cercas describes in his book, The Imposter. Cercas writes that this photograph was taken in the wake of an anarchist demonstration in the 1970s, and that Marco carried this photograph with him everywhere, as something of a badge of honour, lending him false credentials of an anti-fascist fighter involved in political struggle.
Que no era algo incoherente, porque cómo es posible que una persona que da tan...
Something wasn't right, because how is it possible that a person who gives so many talks doesn't want to talk to someone who is interested in his story?
Bermejo started to investigate and spoke to people who Marco crossed paths with before. Former members of the anarchist trade union that Marco was general secretary of harboured major doubts about his past. People involved in other associations for those deported to concentration camps didn't know who he was. And Bermejo wrote to Flossenbürg itself, where the historian working there confirmed they had no record of anyone named Enric Marco Ibaye having been there. Then, Bermejo found a document in the archives of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, dated 1942.
Enrique Marco Ibaye ha sido llamado para el servicio militar.
Enric Marco was called for military service, but his family responded saying he was exempt as he was in Germany voluntarily on something of an official mission as part of an agreement between Franco and Hitler.
This document, though it did show that Marco had travelled to work for the German war machine voluntarily, did not prove that Marco had not spent any time in a concentration camp. But it did open a major hole in the story that he had always publicly told.
Él iba utilizando cosas que se inventaba, pero también utilizaba cosas reales, ¿no?
Marco was mixing elements of his past with his invented history, including real places he had spent time in.
Great lies are constructed from small truths. Enric Marco had been in Germany during the Second World War and indeed spent some months in preventive detention after being arrested by the Gestapo. But decades later he stretched and exaggerated this truth into his story of being in a concentration camp that made him so famous.
Ya poco después, yo tengo noticia ya de que está previsto que Zapatero vaya a ir a las conmemoraciones de Mauthausen.
Shortly after this discovery, I heard the then Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero was going to take part in the Mauthausen commemorations, and I heard that more than likely a Spanish national would be speaking at the event, and I figured it must be Enric Marco.
The possibility of Marco speaking alongside important political figures in Mauthausen on the 60th anniversary of its liberation disturbed Bermejo, so he got to work and wrote a report on his findings, which he sent to the Spanish government, Amical Mauthausen, and the Mauthausen International Committee.
Y además, otra cosa importante para mí.
Another thing important for me, part of my motivation, was the fact that I knew that Marco not only lied about his past, but that he also eclipsed so many people who really were in concentration camps. Some of those Spaniards who were there told me that on more than one occasion he made them shut up simply because he took the limelight because he was so much more eloquent than they were.
Simplemente porque él había tomado la palabra y él era mucho más elocuente, ¿no?
After being found out, Marco was unrepentant, arguing that his efforts brought awareness and understanding to such a difficult issue where there was none before. So I asked Bermejo if he saw any value in this argument from Marco.
No le veo ninguna, me parece horrible.
No way, absolutely not. I think it's horrible. He's a manipulator, he abused so many people's trust to cheat people and then tell them it's for their own good so they would pay attention. I think that's a perverse train of thought. If Marco really wanted to devote himself to raising awareness of history, I would have been up for that. It could have been interesting to hear about his real experiences in Germany, but no, what he did was unjustifiable.
Thank you to Benito Bermejo for talking with us and to you, Cillian, for bringing us that interview. Despite the complex layers of deception, nonetheless there are actually elements of truth to Marco's story.
Yes, very exaggerated, but yes. Marco did actually spend some time in Germany during the war. This came about as a result of a debt that Franco had to Hitler because Hitler helped Franco during the Spanish Civil War. And as a result, they came to an agreement to send labourers to work in factories in the German war machine. And this is how Marco ended up at a factory in Kiel in northern Germany. Shortly after he arrived, he was actually arrested by the Gestapo, accused of spreading communist propaganda, and although he was held prisoner for 7 months, this happened in preventive detention in a standard prison in Kiel, nowhere like the conditions of a concentration camp. And ultimately, importantly, to point out, he was declared innocent and he returned to Spain shortly afterwards.
And a curious fact is that he even lied about his own birthday.
Yeah, this is one of the most ridiculous things about him, in my opinion. He was born on April 12th, 1921, but he always said that his birthday was April 14th, 1921. Why?
Yeah.
Well, this was exactly 10 years before the proclamation of the Spanish Second Republic, as though he were offering some sort of a hint, a suggestion of predetermined greatness. Like that this man was destined to go on to play such a key role in the struggles that he claimed to have suffered and taken part in. Enric Marco's story is kitsch. Javier Cercas continually uses the descriptor kitsch for Enric Marco. This is taken directly from his book, The Imposter. Just as the established entertainment industry feeds on aesthetic kitsch, which offers the consumer the illusion of appreciating genuine art while sparing him the efforts such appreciation requires, so too the modern industry of memory needs to feed on historical kitsch, which offers the consumer the illusion of understanding genuine history while sparing him the effort. Nobody rivaled Enric Marco in providing such sickly, toxic kitsch.
After speaking so much about a life full of lies, we wanted to find out more about the psychology of lying. So we spoke with psychologist Dr. Drew Curtis, who specialises in deceit and pathological liars.
People who are pathological liars do have aspects of compulsive behavior in the sense that they will express some anxiety in the moment and indicate that they lie in response to that anxiety in the social situation, in that in the moment the lie reduces that anxiety. So it has some features of compulsivity to it. And, we get asked this question all the time: why do pathological liars lie, or why does anyone lie? What's the motivation? Most people want to know what's the why, what's the cause. And there's a variety of motivations. In fact, most people who are pathological liars would say they don't know why they lied. Some people do lie for impression management. People do lie for gain. People lie, to get attention. That's a big aspect of lies. Because most of us think that, the boy who cried wolf or getting caught, the consequences of that are not going to be as good as getting the immediate attention. So we're kind of predicting into the future using executive functioning, saying the consequences are going to be worse, A, and then B, there's other ways we can get attention. We don't have to get attention via this vehicle of lying, right? And so that's the process that most adults have for executive functioning. Some of the work I've done with Victoria Tawar, Dr. Tawar in Canada, and Dr. Chris Hart. More recently, we found that adolescent teenagers, pathological liars, they have a deficit in that executive functioning. So they're lying without necessarily the regards to the future consequences. So it's more this immediate gain.
What kinds of reactions would be typically characteristic of a pathological liar once their lie has been revealed?
That's a good question. And that also distinguishes from psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, where you may see a lack of remorse, where there isn't the remorse. What my research has found with pathological liars, they tend to show remorse. So you do see that with pathological liars, and not necessarily with, like I said, psychopathy or other aspects. One of the things that has really grasped my interest, and I've written about this as well, is this disconnect we have as humans between lying and being a liar, or something like that. So when we think of the lies we tell, we tend to not think of ourselves as liars. We tend to think, well, I did this for some noble good. I did this to spare this person's feelings. Everything we do is rooted in some good, but others may do bad things because they're horrible people. Instead of understanding, you should applaud me still because I did all these other good things. Had I not lied, there wouldn't have been all this good. There is a difference between people who just tell lots of lies and pathological liars. And there's a difference from another psychopathology called psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, where people lie with intent to cause harm or harming others, which is not pathological lying. Or people lie without remorse, for example. And so that'd be more of psychopathy.
I am hearing a few things that you've mentioned about psychopathy, and what are the hallmarks of psychopathy? What would they be?
Typically, lack of remorse or empathy. There's going to be, for psychopathy, glib or superficial charm. There's going to be typically aspects of aggression or history with the law, or having some issues with legal concerns. Sometimes we think about pathological liars as cold, calculated, manipulative. What that image is probably more akin to what we associate with psychopathy.
Thank you to Dr. Drew Curtis for taking the time to speak with us. And of course, Enric Marco's case isn't the only instance of someone falsely claiming to have been in a concentration camp. There's also Antonio Pastor from Andalusia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he had a very similar story to Enric Marco, but didn't have the same media prominence. Interestingly, he was also uncovered by the same historians, Benito Bermejo, as well as Sandra Checa.
And he curiously died the same week that Marco was uncovered.
Yeah, this is pretty extraordinary. In May 2005 was an extraordinary time for concentration camp fake victims in Spain.
And on a different note, there's also the case of Tanya Head. She's a Catalan woman who claimed to have been the victim of the 9/11 attacks in New York, but she wasn't even in the US at the time. She joined the World Trade Center Survivors Network support group, and later she even became the group's president, in a surprising parallel to Enric Marco's case.
Yeah, very similar, putting herself, her own protagonism over people who genuinely were there. She was even chosen to lead the first tours of the World Trade Center Visitor Center there at Ground Zero, where she gave tours to former New York mayors Michael Bloomberg, Rudy Giuliani, and also the then New York State Governor George Pataki.
However, unlike genuine victims, these imposters are free to start a new life after they're revealed, leaving the truth behind them. That's almost all we have time for today. But before we go, it's time for our Catalan phrase of the week. Cillian, what have we got?
This week we've got sembla mentida.
It seems like a lie.
Literally, exactly that. Yes, it seems like a lie. And this is a really, really commonly said phrase to say something like, can you believe it? Or I can't believe it. It's unbelievable. So you'd say, c'est la mentira que the president of the Survivors Association for Victims of Concentration Camps was never in a concentration camp.
Similar mentira, but it actually happened. This week on Filling the Sink, we've been talking about Enric Marco and the psychology of lying. Thank you to Benito Bermejo and Drew Curtis for taking the time to talk to us and share your experience. And of course, thank you to Cillian Shields for joining me here in the studio.
And thanks for having me, Beth. Very good podcast.
One of the more memorable ones, yes. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We'll be back again next Saturday with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.